Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was one of those curious London mornings in late autumn. Fog rolled in from the Thames, clinging to the windows of Baker Street and casting the city in a subdued melancholy. I had returned from my morning rounds, rather earlier than usual, my medical practice quiet for once. The warmth of the hearth in our sitting-room, the smell of Turkish tobacco curling in the air, and the presence of my old friend in his familiar cross-legged repose were comforts I welcomed with silent gratitude. Sherlock Holmes was seated in his armchair, fingers steepled, his eyes closed but clearly not asleep. He had not yet spoken since my return, though I noted an unopened telegram upon the table beside him, its envelope still sealed but creased at the corners. The violin case lay on the carpet near his feet, curiously unlocked, and his bow was resting across the mantel, a sign that his morning had been spent in restless thought rather than composition. "You've seen no patients this morning, Watson," Holmes said without opening his eyes. "Indeed. How did you guess?" "Not guess. Deduce. Your coat is still damp from the mist, but your boots bear no trace of mud or street dust. The fog is heavier than it appears, and your umbrella remains dry. Therefore you stepped out but walked little, if at all." I laughed softly. "And you, Holmes? You have not played a note since last night, judging by the bow's resting place." Holmes opened one eye lazily and gestured to the telegram. "A more pressing melody has occupied my mind this morning, one not of strings, but of silence. Read it." I took the telegram and read aloud. "Urgent. Private consultation required. Possible foul play. Case involves Henry Hartley, noted violinist. Victoria Hall incident. Come at once." "Inspector Lestrade, Victoria Hall?" I asked. "Is that not where Hartley was to perform Mendelssohn this week?" Holmes nodded and rose briskly. "Indeed. Come, Watson. A man like Henry Hartley does not cancel a concert lightly. Lestrade rarely uses the word urgent unless death is at the door." Within the hour, we had arrived at Victoria Hall, a haute grand edifice nestled between two publishing houses near Oxford Circus. Its marble foyer, normally bustling with music lovers and performers, was eerily silent. A constable met us at the entrance and led us through a velvet-lined corridor to the performers' quarters backstage. Lestrade was waiting inside a dim dressing-room, where several members of the orchestra huddled nearby, whispering in worried tones. The inspector looked haggard, his moustache damp with nervous perspiration. "Glad you came, Mr. Holmes. This one's a head-scratcher." "What's occurred?" Lestrade gestured towards a table in the corner. Upon it rested a black violin, case scuffed at the edges, its latches sealed shut. "That's Hartley's violin," Lestrade said grimly. "It was found in his dressing-room this morning, untouched. No sign of forced entry, no struggle, no theft. The man himself, however, is gone." "Gone?" I repeated. "As in fled?" Lestrade shook his head. "No one saw him leave. He arrived for rehearsal last night and locked himself in this room. That much we confirmed with several members of the orchestra." At 7:15, the conductor knocked. No answer. They assumed he was deep in practice. An hour later, still no reply. The door was locked from the inside. Holmes bent to examine the case, but did not touch it. The room was locked from within. "Precisely. We had to force the door open this morning." "And no sign of Mr. Hartley inside, not a hair. Just this violin case and his coat on the rack. It's as if he vanished into thin air." Holmes turned to inspect the small room. There was one window, narrow and barred with iron, and a single exit, the door we had just passed through. A fireplace sat dormant in the corner. The gaslight flickered slightly as Holmes moved about. I watched as he began his meticulous study of the scene. He paused by the coat rack, lifting the garment carefully. "No hat," he murmured. "Meaning, either he never arrived, which contradicts our witnesses, or he left in haste and without preparation. But how if the door remained locked?" Holmes stooped beside the violin case and gave it a thoughtful glance. "Do not open that case, Lestrade." "Not yet." Lestrade looked puzzled. "Why ever not?" "Because I believe it holds more than strings and spruce wood," Holmes replied cryptically. "Tell me, what do we know of Mr. Hartley's state of mind in recent weeks?" "One of the violinists mentioned he'd been distracted," Lestrade said. "Snapping at the conductor, missing notes, hardly the behaviour of a man famed for perfection. And his personal life? Unremarkable. A bachelor. No known enemies. Lived alone on Montague Street. Staff haven't seen him since yesterday morning." Holmes tapped a finger against the violin case, his eyes narrowing. "Watson, come, here." I approached as he delicately slid a sheet of paper from beneath the case. It was folded twice, with a small brownish smudge at the edge. Holmes unfolded it and held it to the gaslight. "It's a page from a musical score," he said. "But look here, this note in the margin." He passed it to me. In the lower corner, scribbled in hurried script, were 5 words. "He hears even the silence." I looked at Holmes. "What does it mean?" "It means," he said, rising, "that we are not dealing with an ordinary disappearance. This is not a crime of passion, but of precision. A musician's mind is attuned to patterns, every sound, every pause, and if Hartley left a message in music, it suggests he expected something, or someone." He turned to Lestrade. "Have the building swept for hidden passageways and any recently disturbed brickwork. Then send word to Hartley's home. I want a thorough search of his residence, particularly his music library. And lastly, have a key sent up. I will open this violin case when I'm ready." Lestrade frowned. "You think the case is booby-trapped, I think," Holmes said calmly. "It contains the first true piece of this puzzle." And with that, the great detective returned to his armchair, eyes closed once more. But this time I knew his mind was 1,000 miles away, dancing through shadows, silences, and symphonies yet to be heard. Chapter 2. Holmes and the First. Discussion. The carriage ride from Victoria Hall to Montague Street was conducted in near silence. Holmes sat opposite me, his fingers interlocked and pressed to his lips, his gaze fixed on some invisible point between us. I had grown accustomed to these long silences. What to the untrained eye might appear as idleness, I knew to be intense mental exertion. He was, in all likelihood, sifting through layers of observation, rejecting possibilities, weighing implications. I refrained from interruption. Still, the image of the empty dressing room, the untouched violin case, and Hartley's cryptic message lingered in my own mind like the final note of a dissonant chord. I could not help but break the quiet. "You believe the violin case to be key to this affair?" I asked. Holmes did not move, but replied at once, as if awaiting the prompt. "Not the case, Watson. The context. Consider. A man who depends upon his instrument as a surgeon does a scalpel, leaves it behind while vanishing without a trace. Either he was compelled to abandon it, or he wished us to notice it." "But the room was locked from the inside. How could he have left?" "That is precisely the question," Holmes murmured. "A locked room, a missing man, a cryptic note, and a violin left as though laid upon an altar." We arrived at number 12 Montague Street as dusk began to descend over London. The small townhouse was nondescript, a grey structure with ivy creeping up its flanks and narrow bay windows that gave little view of the interior. A nervous housemaid greeted us, wringing her hands in her apron. "This way, gentlemen," she whispered, leading us into a modest parlour that reeked faintly of varnish and candle wax. We haven't touched a thing. He told me never to move anything in his study, not even to dust." Holmes glanced about briefly. "Quite right. If he was in danger, his study is where we shall find his intentions." The study was on the second floor, a dark and narrow room lined with shelves, all burdened with music scores, biographies of composers and several worn volumes in German. Against the far wall stood a writing desk, and to the left of it a tall cabinet filled with violin parts, bridges, bows, chin rests and rosins, arranged with fastidious care. Holmes moved to the desk and surveyed it without touching a thing. Then he pointed to a stack of parchment bound together by twine. "Watson," he said, "would you kindly read aloud the titles of these pieces?" I did as instructed. "Sonata in E minor, Variations on a Theme of Schubert, Lament for a Lost, City and, Interlude for the Deaf Ear. Curious title, that." Holmes's eyes sparkled. "Indeed, most curious. Look here, on the top page." He leaned in and traced a faint indentation with the tip of his finger. "See this pressure? The ink is gone, but the ghost of the pen remains. He wrote something atop this score and tore it away." Could the missing sheet be the message we found beneath the violin case? Holmes smiled faintly. "It is a possibility worth considering." Opened the desk drawer and produced a small vial of chemical powder from within his own coat, followed by a small sable brush. Sprinkling the powder lightly across the parchment, he tilted the page toward the window where the evening light still lingered. As the grains settled, faint lines appeared, like the bones of a forgotten corpse rising from the soil. "There," Holmes whispered, "let us see what our vanished violinist feared." The words were faint but clear. "If I am not found, follow the music. It hides what the eye sees, but the ear cannot." "What in God's name does that mean?" I muttered. Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned toward the cabinet, opened it, and withdrew a strange-looking mute, an odd contraption shaped like a jaw harp, wrapped in copper wire. "Watson, are you familiar with auditory masking?" "Only in the most general sense. Then allow me to simplify. A sound can be used to conceal another, one frequency masking the presence of another. A simple musical sleight of hand." Holmes turned the mute over thoughtfully. Hartley may have been playing a deeper game than mere music. He may have been sending signals, hiding messages, or recording something others failed to hear. Just then the maid appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "There's a gentleman downstairs. Says he's from the hall. Mr. Felix Morgan. He insists on speaking to someone about Mr. Hartley." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Let us receive him." We descended to the parlour once more, to find a sharply dressed man in his early 50s, with silver at his temples and a pinched mouth that suggested habitual dissatisfaction. "Mr. Holmes, I'm Felix Morgan, director of Victoria Hall. I came as soon as I heard you'd taken the case. This whole business is a disaster. Hartley disappearing, the press swarming, and now tonight's concert cancelled. You knew Mr. Hartley well?" Morgan nodded, though reluctantly. "As well as one knows a genius, which is to say, not at all. Brilliant violinist, difficult temperament, had his demons." "Demons?" "Fear mostly. Paranoia. He was convinced. Someone was trying to ruin him. Claimed his music was being plagiarized, that someone was entering his flat at night. Nonsense, of course." Holmes studied Morgan's face. "Did he confide in anyone at the hall?" Morgan hesitated. He did grow unusually close to the new stagehand. A young fellow named Byron Fielding. Hartley would send for him constantly. Odd, really, as Hartley barely tolerated staff. "Where is this Fielding now?" "Left the premises early yesterday. Called in sick this morning." Holmes's fingers tapped the arm of the chair, in rhythm with some inner metronome. "Mr. Morgan, if you would be so kind as to bring me Mr. Fielding's address, I believe our next step becomes clear." As Morgan departed to retrieve the information, Holmes stood and turned to me. "You see, Watson, the violin case may indeed hold a puzzle, but it is the man behind the music, his fears, his habits, and his final coded message that form the true riddle. Something unseen is being heard, and I intend to listen." With that, he strode back to the desk, seized the mute and score, and tucked them beneath his arm. "We go next," he said with sudden animation, "to hear from a man who claims to be too sick to speak. That alone makes him worth hearing." Chapter 3. The Scene of Deception. The residence of Byron Fielding was a narrow, red-bricked structure in a modest part of Paddington, wedged between a tailor's shop and a bakery that emitted the scent of warm rye and burnt crust. The windows of Fielding's flat were shuttered, despite the hour being early afternoon, and the nameplate on the door, scratched and barely legible, read simply, "B. Fielding." Holmes rapped the brass knocker once, twice, then stood back, his gaze resting on the scuffed threshold as though expecting it to speak. There was no immediate answer. "Do you believe he's truly ill?" I asked. "Unlikely," Holmes replied, "but the nature of his ailment, feigned or not, may tell us more than his health ever could." He knocked again. This time there was a faint shuffle from inside, followed by a drawn-out pause and a hesitant creak of the door. A young man appeared, perhaps in his early 20s, with pale skin, a narrow frame, and eyes that darted restlessly. His dressing gown was loosely tied, and his hair unkempt. "Yes," the man croaked. "Mr. Byron Fielding?" Holmes asked. "That's me. Who's asking?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson." We're looking into the disappearance of Mr. Henry Hartley. You were one of the last people to interact with him. May we come in?" Fielding blinked, his expression tight with worry. I'm not well. You'll be less well if Scotland Yard decides to interpret your absence as evasion," Holmes said smoothly. "I'm quite sure they're watching this place already." That evidently convinced him. With a reluctant sigh, Fielding stepped aside and let us enter. The flat was a simple two-room arrangement. The sitting room bore the unmistakable signs of recent disorder. A teacup smashed near the fireplace, a curtain half drawn and twisted as if yanked, and a music stand with sheets scattered on the floor. Holmes took in every detail with one sweeping glance before addressing the man again. "How long have you worked at Victoria Hall?" "Just over 2 months," Fielding replied. "I'm a student at the Royal College of Music, needed the extra money, and Mr. Hartley took a liking to you." Fielding nodded. He wasn't like people say. I mean, he was, but only at first, cold, precise. But then he started talking to me, late nights after rehearsal. Said I had a good ear, that heard things others missed. Holmes's interest sharpened visibly. "He shared confidences with you, didn't he?" Fielding looked down. "Yes. Said someone was tampering with his compositions. He would write something at home, but when he played it at rehearsal, it didn't sound the same. He thought someone was altering his work. I thought he was losing his mind." "And did you see any evidence?" Fielding hesitated. "Only once. A week ago, he handed me a score and asked me to lock it in the theatre's archives myself. Told me not to trust anyone else. Said he'd encoded something inside it. Do you still have that score?" Fielding turned toward a small bureau and pulled out a sheaf of music parchment, carefully wrapped in wax paper. Holmes took it gently, opened it, and examined the title. "Nocturne in G minor," Holmes read aloud. "Interesting choice." He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed. "Watson, notice the measure numbering on page 4. I looked. They skip from measure 35 directly to 39. Holmes nodded. "A deliberate omission. 4 bars of silence, yet the tempo markings do not adjust. The music, in its time signature, is pretending to continue as normal, which suggests that something is concealed within the silence, I guessed. Exactly." Fielding swallowed. Mr. Hartley said that if anything happened to him, the answer would be between the rests. I didn't know what he meant. Holmes folded the score carefully. Did he mention anyone in particular he suspected? Not by name, but he said someone close, closer than anyone realized, and that the music would reveal it if one listened correctly. Holmes stood. "I believe you, Mr. Fielding, but I also believe you know more than you're admitting." Fielding tensed. "What do you mean?" Holmes fixed him with that quiet, unwavering stare I had come to know too well, the one that peeled back the layers of pretense. There was a struggle in this room. The broken teacup, the dishevelled curtain, the smudged heel print by the grate. Someone visited you recently? Someone you didn't expect? Fielding's composure broke. "It was last night," he said. "A man came by. I didn't see his face. He wore a scarf pulled high. He said if I spoke to anyone about Hartley, I'd be the next one to vanish." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, note that down. This visit suggests a widening circle of interest and danger. Whoever orchestrated Hartley's disappearance now watches those he trusted. "But what does it all mean, Holmes?" I asked as we exited Fielding's flat. "The music, the coded messages, the violin left behind?" Holmes answered as we reached the street, the fading light casting a long shadow behind him. "It means, my dear Watson, that Hartley believed he was playing a concert in two movements, the first audible, the second invisible. The man may be gone, but he left behind a composition in which every silence speaks volumes." He held up the nocturne and tapped it lightly. "And now we must listen." Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. That evening, we returned to Baker Street with the nocturne in G minor tucked securely in Holmes's coat. The fog had thickened across London, blurring gas lamps and cloaking the world in an uneasy silence, as though the city itself had been drawn into Hartley's mysterious composition. Holmes wasted no time. Once seated before the hearth, he spread the musical score upon the table and set a magnifying lens beside it. He lit his pipe and leaned forward, the flickering light catching the sharp line of his cheek as he pored over every bar and rest as though they were hieroglyphs. "Musicians, Watson," he said without looking up, "are not unlike detectives. Both deal in pattern, timing, and the unseen structure beneath the apparent surface." I watched the page from over his shoulder. The missing measures still puzzled me. But if Hartley meant to hide something within the silence, how could it be discovered by the eye? Would it not require performance? Holmes's eyes narrowed. But that is the mistake most would make. Assuming music must be heard to, be understood. To a trained mind, what is unplayed can be just as telling. He tapped his pipe against the fireplace and stood abruptly. "Enough theory for the moment. It is time we met the cast of this little symphony. Lestrade has arranged for interviews with the key members of the Victoria Hall Company. We arrived shortly after 7 o'clock at the concert hall, now shrouded in darkness save for a few lamps burning backstage. The entrance was guarded by a pair of constables, who nodded us through with crisp efficiency. Inside, Lestrade waited, in the green room, where 4 individuals were seated in stiff silence around a long table. He nodded as we entered. "Here they are, Holmes. The conductor, the first chair violinist, Hartley's former protégé, and the house manager. All people who worked closely with him." Holmes took them in with a single sweeping glance, then approached the table. "Let us not waste time with pleasantries," he said coolly. "You are all here because you knew Henry Hartley, some intimately, some professionally. I shall speak with each of you briefly. Dr. Watson will observe." He turned to the conductor, a tall, stoop-shouldered man with thinning grey hair and pince-nez that kept slipping down his nose. "Mr. Alain Dupont," Holmes began, "you worked with Hartley for how long?" 6 years, Dupont replied in a faint French accent. "He was brilliant, yes, but eccentric. He treated each rehearsal like a military drill. We quarrelled frequently. Over music and over control. Hartley detested improvisation. Even I, the conductor, was not permitted to adjust his phrasing. He said I lacked his ear." "Did he ever mention fearing for his safety?" Dupont shifted. "He did once say someone had copied his unpublished work, that a fragment had appeared in another composer's hands, but he would not tell me who." Holmes nodded and moved on, The first-chair violinist was a striking woman in her late 30s, tall, with a composed expression and piercing dark eyes. Her name was Miss Elena Vesalius, and she had a reputation as one of London's finest performers. "You and Hartley performed duets?" "Regularly," she said. "We were close for a time." "What way?" "I shall not pretend we were lovers," she said coolly, "but we shared a connection deeper than words. He trusted me with his first drafts. He once said my interpretations were the only ones that made him doubt his own." Holmes observed her carefully. "And recently?" She looked away. He pulled back, grew secretive, distant. I asked if I'd offended him. He said I hadn't, but that a dissonant note had entered his melody. I assumed it was some new paranoia. Holmes nodded slowly. "And yet you still perform here." "I had a contract." And Hartley was not an easy man to grieve. So came the protégé, a nervous young man named Paul Reiner, no older than 20, with fingers stained by ink and rosin. He stared at the table as Holmes addressed him. "You studied under Hartley?" "Yes," he said softly. "I worshipped him. Everyone did." "Did he share his music with you?" "Not lately. He said I was too green, too trusting. But he warned me, said the hall had ears in the walls, that someone wanted to silence him." "Did he name anyone?" "No, only that he felt surrounded. He'd sit backstage with his eyes closed and say he could feel it. The pressure building, like a chord ready to break." Finally, Holmes turned to the house manager, a stout balding man named Cyril Hargreaves, with a florid complexion and a perpetually perspiring brow. "Mr. Hargreaves," Holmes said, "you ran the daily operations here. Tell me, was anyone accessing the backstage areas without proper notice?" Hargreaves hesitated. "No, I mean, perhaps. There's a service passage behind the west wing, used for moving props. It connects to an old storage tunnel below the hall. Staff aren't meant to use it, but there are no locks." "Could someone have entered Hartley's room without being seen?" "Yes, that is, if they knew about the tunnel." Holmes exchanged a glance with Lestrade. "And how many people know of its existence?" "Only long-standing staff. Myself, possibly Dupont, certainly Hartley." With that, Holmes turned and paced slowly across the room, his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke, it was more to himself than to us. A tunnel, a missing man, a locked room, and a handful of musicians playing a concerto of silence. He paused, then turned to Lestrade. "Have the tunnel searched, every inch, and have a map of it brought to Baker Street by morning." Then he faced the assembled group once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your candour. But understand this: Henry Hartley did not vanish in panic. He vanished with purpose, and one of you may already know why." As we stepped out into the night air again, the mist had thickened further. Holmes lit a match, held it to his pipe, and took a long pull. "What do you think, Holmes?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "Someone here is not merely hiding a motive, Watson. They are hiding a method. And until we learn how Hartley disappeared, we shall never understand why." Chapter 5. The Red Herring. The next morning arrived as a curtain of grey light filtering through the blinds at Baker Street, accompanied by the rustle of newspapers and the scent of coffee. I had scarcely poured myself a cup when Holmes appeared, already dressed and reading a freshly delivered map of the Victoria Hall's understructure, his eyes darting across the blue-ink diagram with unnerving speed. "Here, Watson," he said, tapping a section with his forefinger. "This service tunnel Hargreaves mentioned, it begins in the storage cellars beneath the west corridor, and according to this, it runs behind the performers' dressing rooms. It even intersects with a disused coal chute." "Could someone have entered Hartley's dressing room through it?" I asked. Holmes nodded grimly. "More than that. Someone could have exited without unlocking the door, which would explain our locked room dilemma." Before I could speak again, a brisk knock came at the door. Lestrade entered, brushing rain from his coat, his expression one of forced confidence but veiled uncertainty. "Well, Holmes," he said, "I believe we've got our man." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Have we?" Lestrade withdrew a small brown notebook from his inner pocket and handed it to Holmes. "Found in Fielding's flat, stuffed between some floorboards. Contains multiple references to Hartley, some rather obsessive, sketches of musical notation, most of it nonsensical, and a crude drawing of what looks like the violin case." Holmes examined it silently. "One page," Lestrade continued, "says the case holds more than the man. Another, he trusts me, but not enough. Seems our young Mr. Fielding had an unhealthy fixation." Holmes passed the notebook to me. Its margins were littered with erratic scrawls, half-thoughts, odd symbols, broken words. Trap the rest in silence. Shadows need rehearsing too. It read more like the diary of a dreamer, or a madman. "And what of motive?" Holmes asked evenly. "Jealousy, perhaps," Lestrade said. "Fielding's a failed composer by all accounts. Maybe he thought Hartley stole his work, or was about to. That sort of bitterness festers, Holmes." Holmes did not respond immediately. He crossed to the fireplace and stood with his back to us, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, it was in a tone both calm and absolute. "No," Lestrade blinked. "No? The book is a plant," Holmes said. "It is too carefully ambiguous, too poetic in its madness. Fielding may be unstable, but he is not theatrical. He lacked the nerve to lie convincingly when we met him. This, by contrast, is the work of someone who wants us to believe he's capable of delusion." I glanced again at the final page of the notebook, which bore a single line. "The rest will come after the coda." Holmes continued. "He was frightened, yes, intimidated, certainly, but not capable of orchestrating this alone. No, Lestrade, we are being offered a red herring." "Well," Lestrade said, somewhat disgruntled, "until you find your mystery maestro, I'll keep Fielding under guard." "Do so," Holmes replied, "and meanwhile I shall speak to someone with a composer's ear and a liar's tongue." I raised an eyebrow. "Miss Vesalius?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "She strikes me as a woman who sees every note not as sound but as leverage. Come, Watson, it's time we disturbed her morning practice." We found Elena Vesalius in her Bloomsbury flat, sunlight streaming through tall windows, bow in hand, tuning her violin with the cool intensity of a surgeon, sharpening a blade. She greeted us with composed civility and motioned for us to sit while she rose and dusted the strings. "I presume you have more questions," she said, not looking up. "Only one to begin with," Holmes said. "Did you know of Hartley's Nocturne in G-bid minor?" "I did," she replied evenly. He composed it in the final weeks before his disappearance, claimed it was his most personal work. Yet you never mentioned it. I didn't think it relevant." Holmes smiled thinly. "A curious omission, considering the score contains deliberate anomalies, hidden silences, missing measures, as if the very composition was a message." Now she looked up, her fingers pausing on the strings. He was always dramatic. He said music could outlive the man, carry the truth where words could not. Holmes stepped closer. And did he ever suggest what truth that might be? A flicker passed across her face, gone in a breath, but not unseen. "No," she said, "only that someone was listening too closely." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Tell me, Miss Vesalius, what did Hartley fear more, plagiarism or betrayal?" She set the violin down with deliberate care. "I think, Mr. Holmes," she said slowly, "that Hartley no longer trusted his own judgment. He feared betrayal because he had begun to expect it, even from those closest to him." "You included?" She didn't answer. Holmes studied her for a moment longer, then turned to go. As we descended the stairs, I asked, "Do you believe her?" "Partially," he replied. "Her reactions are rehearsed, but one cannot rehearse hesitation. She lied, briefly, then resumed the truth." "Lied about what?" "About the nocturne. She knew more than its name. She's seen the missing measures before, perhaps even played them, and I suspect she knows what Hartley hid there." Back at Baker Street that evening, Holmes returned to the score and once again examined the skipped bars. He held a tuning fork to the edge of the parchment, struck it, and watched how the vibrations interacted with the ink. I observed curiously. "Expecting the page to sing, Holmes?" "In a sense. Look here, these marks." He gestured to a faint line of dots between the bars. "Not ink. Impressions, perhaps made by a pencil, then erased, barely visible under normal light." He held the paper over a lamp and tilted it slightly. The dots became more distinct, 5 per measure, spaced irregularly. Then I saw it, notation, but not for strings. "Morse code," Holmes said softly. "What does it say?" He read slowly. Hartley knew. The silence is the key. Not the violin, but what it concealed. Holmes exhaled through his nose. So, not a musical message, but a mechanical one. I leaned forward. "The violin case." Holmes nodded. "Precisely, but not the instrument, the interior." He stood with sudden urgency. "Watson, we must return to Victoria Hall. The case remains unopened." Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. It was nearly 9:30 when we returned to Victoria Hall. The building loomed against the murky night like a half-sunken relic of some forgotten empire, its grandeur dampened by fog and a lingering sense of unease. Lestrade was already inside, flanked by 2 constables and a watchman who had remained behind to guard the premises overnight. The violin case had been left untouched, precisely where Holmes had instructed it to remain. We found it in the same dressing room from which Henry Hartley had vanished, still resting atop the narrow table beneath the vanity mirror, its latches firmly sealed, its surface reflecting the faint flicker of the gas lamps. The room smelled of varnish and old dust, and the atmosphere was tense with unspoken questions. Holmes approached it with measured steps. He paused, pulled on a pair of kid gloves, and then crouched beside the case. "You may want to stand back," he said quietly, almost as an afterthought. I obeyed at once, and Lestrade did the same, though he looked sceptical. "Do you believe it's trapped, Holmes?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that it is not what it appears to be." He examined the latches first, not merely with his eyes, but with a jeweller's loupe from his pocket. Then, from the lining of his coat, he withdrew a slender brass pick and a length of twine. Gently, carefully, he inserted the pick under the left latch and twisted. There was a faint click, not mechanical, but weighted. Holmes froze. "There is a false tension in the hinge," he murmured. "Something within is designed to shift weight when opened, but only if done hastily." He reached for the right latch and performed the same procedure, this time slowly, as if the case itself might exhale at any moment. At last, the lid creaked open. Inside was not the polished spruce of a Stradivarius, nor the velvet lining expected of a concert performer's cherished instrument. Instead, the interior had been entirely hollowed out. Where a violin ought to have rested, there was a compartment, neatly carved and padded with dense grey felt. Within this strange recess lay a single object, a brass cylinder, perhaps 6 inches long, wrapped in tightly coiled copper wire. Holmes did not touch it immediately. Instead, he produced a handkerchief and gently lifted the cylinder into the lamplight. Lestrade peered at it. "What in heaven's name is that?" "A phonograph spool," Holmes said, turning it slowly. "An Edison model, American and rare in this format. It's been wrapped in copper to reduce magnetic interference. Whatever is recorded on this, Hartley considered it precious." "But why hide it in a violin case?" I asked. "Why not keep it locked away?" Holmes looked at me. "Because no one would question a violinist guarding his case with religious care. It's the perfect decoy, public yet private. But the more telling question is, what did he record?" Holmes stood, carefully placing the spool into a satchel he had brought. "There is only one way to find out." By midnight we were back at Baker Street. Holmes, with characteristic efficiency, had sent for an associate, Mr. Colum Beringer, a tinkerer and audiophile who resided in Soho and owed Holmes several favours. Within the hour, Beringer arrived carrying a portable wax-cylinder phonograph, which he assembled on our sitting-room table with surprising speed. Holmes inserted the spool delicately, then sat back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Beringer turned the crank. The device crackled to life. There was a hiss of static, then music. A violin, faint and trembling, played a slow, deliberate scale. The tone was distorted, as though the musician were standing at the end of a long corridor. A few measures passed, followed by silence. And then a voice, thin, breathless, unmistakably Hartley's. "If you are hearing this, I am likely already gone." The room went still. "I believe I am being watched." Followed, "The music has become a means of concealment, not expression. I cannot trust the written word. They steal it. I cannot trust the people I once admired. They echo too closely." A pause. Then, "The man I fear most is among my colleagues. One of them has taken fragments of my work. Fragments only I could have composed. They appear in programs before mine, performed as if their origin were innocent. But they are mine. I know it, and I believe they are listening through others. Even now, I do not speak freely. I speak only in rests. Another silence. Elena suspects nothing, but I fear Dupont. There is something in his eyes when I play, as if he hears more than sound. I saw him backstage last week, alone, near the archives. He lied when I confronted him. Said he was looking for a misplaced baton. The voice trembled. If I disappear, I beg you, do not trust what is written. Listen to what it is missing. The recording ended with a harsh scrape. We sat in silence for several seconds. Lestrade was the first to speak. So, it was Dupont? Holmes did not answer. He leaned forward and removed the cylinder from the machine, wrapping it again in cloth. Then he turned to me. "Well, Watson, I'm not sure what to say." He seemed convinced. Indeed, but conviction and truth are not the same. Hartley feared Dupont, but that does not confirm guilt. It merely points toward a perception, accurate or otherwise. Lestrade scratched his chin. "So what now?" "Now," Holmes said, rising, "we test perception against evidence." He paced slowly. "Dupont has motive, professional rivalry, perhaps even theft. Hartley's scores were his legacy. If someone tampered with them, the injury would be unforgivable. But I am not yet satisfied." He stopped abruptly. "Tomorrow, we attend rehearsal at Victoria Hall. I wish to hear how Mr. Dupont conducts silence." "Silence?" I asked. "Yes," Holmes said with a gleam in his eye. "It is the one note that cannot lie." Chapter 7. The Crime Grows. Stranger. We returned to Victoria Hall the following morning, the fog having receded, but leaving behind a lingering dampness that clung to the steps and railings like a forgotten thought. Holmes was in unusually high spirits, his coat buttoned tight and his boots echoing crisply against the marbled hallway as we made our way to the rehearsal chamber. "Few appreciate," he remarked, "how much can be revealed in a rehearsal. Unlike a performance, a rehearsal is unguarded. Mistakes are allowed, habits are exposed. And in that looseness," I added, "you hope to observe something concealed? Not hope, Watson, intend." The rehearsal was already underway when we slipped quietly into the back of the hall. A dozen musicians occupied the stage in scattered clusters, tuning and adjusting, while the conductor, Alain Dupont, stood at his podium leafing through a marked score. From this distance he appeared composed, though Holmes's eyes were fixed on him with unwavering scrutiny. The piece under rehearsal was Brahms's Violin Concerto in D major, a technically demanding composition known for its blend of lyrical grace and structural complexity. Miss Elena Vesalius stood at the fore, violin in hand, bow poised in the air as Dupont raised his baton. "From measure 72, Dupont called out. The orchestra launched into a sweeping passage. I noted Holmes's eyes drifted not to Vesalius, nor to the orchestra as a whole, but solely to Dupont. He observed the conductor's fingers, his cues, the almost imperceptible twitch of his shoulders. Then came a sudden interruption. Dupont halted the orchestra with a sharp motion. "Cellos!" he barked. "You're dragging the downbeat. The silence before Vesalius enters must be clean, not a breath too long." "Very particular," I whispered. Holmes nodded, because he understands silence intimately. He manipulates it like a big sculptor works marble. The musicians resumed. The room was filled with sound, yes, but it was within the gaps that Holmes was listening. His gaze narrowed at every pause, every rest, every fractional beat that passed in ghostly quiet. Then, just as Vesalius prepared to enter with her solo, Holmes straightened in his chair. "Did you hear it?" he asked softly. "Hear what?" "There, between the rests." Dupont delayed her entrance by half a beat, deliberately. He anticipated a silence that didn't belong to Brahms. Perhaps artistic license? Holmes shook his head. It was not Brahms he was conducting in that moment. It was something else, something he expected. When the rehearsal ended, Holmes rose and approached Dupont directly. "A fine performance," he said politely. "But you favour the rests, do you not?" Dupont looked startled. "I beg your pardon." "You pay special attention to the spaces between, as if you conduct what is not played rather than what is." Dupont's jaw tightened. "Music, sir, is nothing without silence. Anyone who studies composition knows this." "Quite so," Holmes replied. "And yet you paused a half-beat too long before Vesalius's solo. It threw her timing. Even she noticed it." Dupont turned toward Vesalius, who, still gathering her things, gave a subtle nod of confirmation. I was distracted," Dupont said. Holmes nodded. "Of course. I wonder, Mr. Dupont, would you be so kind as to accompany us for a moment? I have something I'd like you to hear." We returned to Hartley's old dressing room. The violin case had been moved to Baker Street, but the atmosphere remained charged with the memory of absence. Holmes had brought the phonograph with him, now fitted with Hartley's wax cylinder. He set it atop the vanity, cranked it slowly, and nodded to Dupont. "You may want to listen carefully," Hartley's voice crackled once more through the speaker. "The man I fear most is among my colleagues. I saw him backstage last week, alone, near the archives." Dupont's face paled as the voice continued. When it ended, silence fell like a curtain. "You deny being there?" Holmes asked. Dupont's hands clenched. "No, I was there, but I was looking for an old score. Hartley accused me. He believed I had copied him. He grew paranoid, began seeing theft in every staff member, every musician. Did you steal from him?" Dupont's lips thinned. "I influenced him. That is not a crime. Every composer borrows." "But hiding in the archives?" Holmes asked. "That requires guilt, not admiration." Dupont said nothing. Holmes studied him a moment longer, then spoke to Lestrade, who had been quietly observing from the corner. "Watch him closely, but don't arrest him, not yet." Lestrade blinked. "Why not?" "Because," Holmes said calmly, "I believe Hartley was wrong. Dupont may be a thief of style and silence, but he is not a kidnapper. There is another hand yet to be seen." Later that night, Holmes paced the length of our sitting room, deep in thought. I watched the fire burn low, and waited for him to speak. "It grows stranger by the hour, Watson," he said at last. "Every suspect fits a piece of the puzzle, but not the full shape. Hartley feared Dupont, yet also trusted him with his most complex scores. He warned Fielding, yet left him alive. Vesalius knew more than she admitted. yet helped in the search. I nodded, and none of them had reason to kill him or abduct him. Precisely, Holmes said, which brings us to a difficult conclusion. What if Hartley orchestrated this disappearance himself? I stared. You believe he vanished voluntarily? Consider, Watson. He built layers of secrecy, planted recordings, wrote messages in music. He prepared for something. Either he feared death, or planned a performance no one would forget. A final act? I asked slowly. Holmes's eyes glittered. Perhaps. But if so, we have not yet heard its climax. And I suspect we shall, very soon. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. Holmes spent much of the following morning in a state I had come to recognize as his most dangerous. That curious mix of silence and stillness which belied an inner tempest of deduction. He sat by the window of our Baker Street rooms, motionless but for the occasional tap of his index finger against the sill. Outside, a rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then steady, casting fine streaks across the glass, as though the city itself were weeping in time with Hartley's phantom violin. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the silence, "have you ever considered how one might vanish not by going elsewhere, but by convincing the world they have ceased to exist? I imagine it would require a good deal of deception," I said, startled from my reading, "and a remarkable command over the perceptions of others." Precisely. And what is the hallmark of a brilliant performer, if not that very command? Lowered my paper. You believe Hartley staged his own disappearance? I believe it's possible. The clues point in two directions, either to an external threat or an elaborate internal scheme. I intend to test both. He stood, reached for his overcoat, and motioned for me to follow. We are returning to Victoria Hall, but this time I shall not enter as myself. I blinked. A disguise? Something subtle, he said with a smile. Not a costume, but a character. A curious patron with an unusual request. When duty, we arrived at the hall. The rehearsal had ended, and the musicians were dispersing in the corridor. Holmes paused near the side entrance, adjusted his scarf, and slouched his posture slightly. He affected a limp, tugged the brim of his hat low, and darkened his voice by half an octave. He looked like an aging dilettante in search of forgotten grandeur. "I shall approach Vesalius," he said. "You, Watson, remain close, but do not interfere." I nodded and stepped aside. Holmes, now Mr. Wycliffe, as he would later reveal, approached Elena Vesalius with a curious reverence, his hands clasped before him as though he were about to ask a favour from royalty. "Pardon me, Miss Vesalius," he said. "You may not know me. I'm Charles Wycliffe, an enthusiast of your work. I attended your Schubert recital last winter." She offered a polite but cautious nod. "Thank you, Mr. Wycliffe. I wasn't aware I had gained such a following." "Oh, indeed," Holmes said with subtle theatrics. "But it is not Schubert that brings me. It is Henry Hartley. I was quite moved by his disappearance." She stiffened at the mention of Hartley's name. "I've recently acquired a rare composition of his," Holmes continued. "A fragment, really. Odd little thing, missing bars, sudden pauses. He called it the Echo Suite." Vesalius's eyes widened, just slightly, but enough. "I was told," Holmes said gently, that only one person besides Hartley had ever performed it. That person, I believe, is you." There was a long pause. I watched her throat tighten before she answered. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Holmes replied softly. "I'm told the piece is not complete, that it hides something." She looked around, then stepped closer, her voice low. "Why are you asking this? Who are you really?" Holmes straightened. His voice returned to normal. "I think you already know." A beat passed. Her expression shifted, not to surprise, but resignation. She did not shout or recoil. She simply sighed and said, "Come with me." She led us down a stairwell we had not previously explored, one used by stage hands and instrument porters, to a narrow passage at the rear of the hall. At the end was a small rusted door. She withdrew a key from her sleeve and opened it. Inside was a cramped storage room, barely large enough for 2 people. Dusty trunks were stacked in the corner. In the centre sat a covered object, draped in black cloth. Vesalius peeled it away to reveal an upright phonograph, larger than any I had seen. Beside it, neatly stacked, were 6 additional wax cylinders. "He asked me to keep them hidden," she said. "Told me they were safer here than in his home. That if anything happened to him, I should deliver them to no one, unless I heard someone mention the Echo Suite." Holmes glanced at me. "A musical passphrase." She nodded. He was paranoid, yes, but also precise. He said the music would carry his voice even after silence claimed him. Holmes examined the machine. "You've listened to these?" "No," she said. "He made me swear not to. He said the order of the cylinders mattered, that the story would make sense only if told in the right sequence." Holmes bent to examine the base of the machine. A small number had been scratched into each cylinder, barely visible to the eye. "Look here, Watson, 1 through 7. This machine is no ordinary phonograph. It has a spindle that changes reels in sequence. An early prototype of Hartley's, own design, I suspect." He looked at Vesalius. "You never once yielded to curiosity?" "I was tempted, but I respected his wishes." Holmes stood straight. "Then the next step is clear. We bring this machine to Baker Street." She hesitated. "Is that wise? If what he feared is true, someone may be watching still." Holmes offered her a rare smile. "Let them watch. It's time we played Hartley's final score, sir." That evening, the phonograph was carefully transported to our sitting room and placed upon the table near the fire. Holmes spent the next hour inspecting every mechanical detail, confirming that the cylinders advanced properly, that the sound head was clean, and that the sequence could be engaged without interruption. He turned to me once everything was in order. "This, Watson, is either the ravings of a man undone by fear, or the final movement in a performance unlike any we've encountered. Do you believe he's still alive?" "I believe," Holmes said, setting the needle upon the first cylinder, "that we are about to find out." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The clock on the mantel struck midnight as Holmes delicately placed the needle upon the first cylinder of Hartley's phonograph. The faintest hiss gave way to the unmistakable warmth of analog sound, the room filling with the same ghostly resonance that had accompanied the earlier message. Only now it was richer, fuller, layered with the quiet ache of Hartley's voice and mind. "This is Henry Hartley," came the voice, tired, deliberate. "If you are hearing this, the first safeguards have failed. I am either missing or presumed dead. But understand, this is not a confession. It is a reconstruction." We sat forward, barely breathing. To know the truth, you must follow the silences. Listen to what I do not say. Each cylinder contains a portion of the truth, arranged not chronologically, but thematically. This is the only way to protect what remains. A violin arpeggio followed, played slowly, each note like a cautious footstep across ice. Then came the second cylinder, which switched over automatically with a satisfying click. There were 3 who knew. 1 betrayed. 1 feared. 1 remained, silent. I left clues, scattered in the compositions. Elena knew fragments. Byron knew more than he realized, but only he had access to the archive. I glanced at Holmes. He must mean DuPont. Holmes nodded but did not speak. The third cylinder played next. They tried to silence me once already. Poisoned rosin. I caught it just in time. My bow seized up during rehearsal. I told no one, not even Eleanor. I could no longer trust the hall. I could no longer trust them. A pause. But if they come again, if they succeed, I have made preparations. I will not die before my final movement is heard. As the cylinder clicked off and the fourth prepared to spool, a sudden noise shattered the silence. A thud, followed by the unmistakable crack of splintered wood. Holmes and I leapt to our feet. From the hallway outside the flat, something or someone had forced entry. Holmes grabbed the poker from the hearth and signalled for me to douse the lights. I did so, plunging the room into shadows. We crouched behind the sitting-room door, the faint hum of the phonograph continuing as the fourth cylinder played on, its ghostly music now joined by a new, far more corporeal danger. The footsteps came soft, deliberate, creeping across the hallboards toward us. Then a figure burst into the room. I lunged instinctively, and Holmes followed, striking the intruder's arm with the flat of the poker. A grunt of pain, and the man stumbled back, nearly knocking over the phonograph. Holmes seized him by the collar and threw him to the floor as I lit the lamp. There, pinned beneath Holmes's knee, was a man in dark clothing, mud on his boots, a black scarf wrapped around his lower face. Lestrade burst through the door moments later. 2 constables in tow caught him red-handed. Holmes barked. He was coming for the cylinders. They pulled the man upright and tore the scarf from his face. I gasped. "Paul Reiner?" I said in disbelief. The protégé, pale, trembling and wide-eyed, stared at Holmes, then at the phonograph. "I didn't want to hurt anyone, I swear. I needed to know what he said, what he knew." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "You've been listening all along." Reiner's voice was frantic. "He said I was the one who feared. He didn't say I betrayed him." "But you knew someone did," Holmes said coldly. "And you didn't speak, because you were protecting someone." Reiner said nothing. Holmes continued, quieter now. "Let me guess. He told you about the archive, about the poisoned rosin, about the scores that were altered, and you said nothing because you believed it would bring down the hall, and your career with it." Tears welled in the young man's eyes. I didn't want to believe it, but Dupont, he told me Hartley was unstable, that he'd imagined it all. I didn't know what to believe. Holmes stood. Belief is immaterial. You acted on fear, and fear, in this case, was nearly fatal. Lestrade led Reiner away in cuffs, promising a full statement at Scotland Yard. Once the room was secured again, Holmes turned back to me. We were being watched, Watson, not by a killer, but by a coward. He wasn't trying to destroy the recordings. He was trying to understand them, before the truth named names. We sat once more by the fire, the phonograph still spinning its slow, haunting message. The 5th cylinder began. By now, someone has tried to stop this. I suspect Paul. He lacks malice, but not cowardice. I warned him once. If he acts again, he is no longer innocent. Holmes exhaled. Hartley knew everything, even Reiner's limits, the bare voice continued, but cowardice is not the core of this mystery. It is ambition. He wanted my work, not just to steal it, but to own it. He envied me. He watched me. He waited. I leaned in. Who, Holmes? Dupont? Holmes shook his head slowly. No, Watson. The man who said the least. The one who stayed, invisible amidst the noise. He tapped the list of Hartley's closest colleagues. Vesalius, Dupont, Reiner, and at the bottom, almost forgotten, Cyril Hargreaves. Holmes whispered, the man who knew the tunnels, the one who had keys to every room, who heard everything, said nothing, and hid in plain sight. We had been looking for a man of music, but the real conductor of this silent symphony had been behind the curtain all along. Chapter 10. The True. Motive begins to surface. Morning light crept slowly across the sitting room of 231B Baker Street, casting elongated shadows from the phonograph, now still and silent as if in mourning. Holmes had not slept. He paced the floor in quiet concentration, hands clasped behind his back, eyes sharp and distant. The name Cyril Hargreaves lingered between us like an unresolved chord. "You're certain?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. As certain as I was that Reiner lacked the steel for murder, Holmes replied. Hargreaves is the one thread in this tapestry that has remained unexamined. He is everywhere, yet invisible. A man whose occupation requires silence, whose presence is expected but ignored. He had access, I said, recalling our earlier interviews. He knew about the service tunnel and the archive. He could have entered Hartley's dressing room without detection. Precisely, Holmes said. He also knew the layout of Victoria Hall better than any conductor or performer. If Hartley suspected someone was altering his scores or tampering with his instruments, who better to do so unnoticed than the man responsible for managing the entire premises? Holmes stepped to his desk and pulled open a drawer, withdrawing a folded document, one of the stage schematics acquired earlier from Lestrade. Observe this. He pointed to a narrow passage connecting the West Archive chamber to the storage tunnel behind the dressing rooms. It's unmarked on most staff copies. Hargreaves confirmed it only when pressed. A man could move unseen from the bowels of the building to Hartley's private space and back, without leaving so much as a footprint in the main corridors. And the motive? I asked. Is it merely theft? Jealousy? Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he turned, his expression clouded with something akin to sorrow. "Let us see if the sixth cylinder provides clarity." He loaded the spool and turned the crank. The machine whirred to life once more, and Hartley's voice returned. Now, quieter, as if recorded late at night, his breath laboured. "There is a fourth player, one who never appeared in the compositions, one whose name does not grace programmes or publications. Yet he lingers, always near. He watches rehearsals. He reads the scores. He speaks only when necessary." A pause. Then, "I trusted him once, not with music, but with safety. He managed the hall like a steward of tradition, but tradition gave way to resentment." Holmes and I exchanged glances. I believe Hargreaves took my sketches, the ones I discarded in frustration. He salvaged them, sold them, perhaps even passed them on to other composers under the guise of found ideas. I noticed the theft too late. By then, the phrases I'd abandoned had been performed elsewhere, renamed, rearranged, but unmistakably mine. The voice trembled. When I confronted him, he denied everything, said the hall belonged to all who served it, that I owed it my music. I laughed. He did not. The cylinder clicked to a halt. Holmes turned slowly. And there we have it. "A hidden grudge," I murmured, "years in the making." "Not merely a grudge," Holmes said, pacing again. "A philosophy." Hargreaves believed Hartley owed his success to the institution, not to his own brilliance. And when that brilliance became possessive, when Hartley began hiding scores and composing in secret, Hargreaves saw it as a betrayal, an affront to the institution he had devoted his life to. I sat back. And so he began to act. Holmes nodded. Subtly at first, tampering, misplacing, then stealing and repurposing. When Hartley grew suspicious, he tried to unnerve him, altering the environment, sowing doubt among the orchestra. Finally, when Hartley recorded these cylinders, he knew the end was near. So he vanished, perhaps with help. Or perhaps he was taken. A knock sounded at the door. Lestrade entered, looking unusually grim. "We've brought in Hargreaves," he said without preamble. "Found him trying to leave London via the early mail train to Dover. Had a trunk full of personal documents, and this." He held out a small folder. Holmes opened it. Inside were several handwritten sheets, music notations bearing Hartley's signature flourishes, and yet each was signed C. Hargreaves. Lestrade grimaced. He claims Hartley gave them to him, that they were abandoned works, that he meant to preserve them. Holmes scoffed. Preservation through forgery? Hardly the act of an honest man. Still, Lestrade said, he swears he didn't harm Hartley, says he hasn't seen him in days, that the man simply disappeared, same as we all think. Holmes's face darkened. He may be telling the truth. Hargreaves was not reckless. He was calculated. If he did something final, it would not be left to chance. He looked toward the phonograph. "There is one final cylinder," he said quietly, "and I suspect it will tell us whether Hartley vanished or was erased." We sat in tense silence as Holmes fitted the seventh and last spool into place. "If you've reached this recording," Hartley's voice came once more, "then you know the truth, or most of it. Hargreaves was never just a manager. He was a frustrated artist. He once showed me his compositions, clumsy, derivative. I encouraged him. He mistook that for license. When I withdrew, when I began to guard my work, he saw it as betrayal. His revenge was not murder, but theft. A slow, meticulous hollowing out of my life's work, piece by piece. I am leaving this place, not through force, but choice. The hall has become a stage for lies. I will vanish as I arrived, unannounced, unnoticed. Let them wonder. But if the lies continue, if someone else is blamed, I leave this as record. Let the truth sing, even in silence. And with that, the cylinder fell silent. We sat motionless. Holmes stood slowly and said, "There, the crime was not one of blood, but of erasure, of identity. Hargreaves didn't kill Hartley. He made him disappear, artistically, publicly, intellectually. He stole his legacy." Lestrade exhaled. "We'll charge him with fraud, theft, attempted intimidation, likely prison. But Hartley, he's really gone?" Holmes looked to the window, where a pale morning sun was rising. "No, Lestrade," he said softly. "He's still playing, just in a place none of us can hear." Chapter 11. The Bait, Holmes's Grand Strategy. By mid-morning, the rain had ceased, but a tension still hung over London, particularly within the walls of Victoria Hall. Though Hargreaves had been taken into custody, the matter was far from resolved. Holmes, ever restless in the final throes of deduction, paced our Baker Street sitting-room with a deliberate rhythm, his violin resting untouched on the mantel. "You don't believe he's telling the whole truth," I said. Holmes paused. "No, Watson. I believe Hargreaves said what he needed to say. Not a word more. His motive is sound, his behaviour consistent. But something still eludes me." He turned toward the phonograph, now silent after playing the final of Hartley's 7 cylinders. Hartley claimed he was leaving voluntarily. But where is he? If he staged his own disappearance, why the need for so elaborate a system of recordings and riddles? And if he truly feared for his life, why not simply vanish outright? Why leave a trail at all? "You suspect he's still nearby?" I asked. "I suspect," Holmes replied, "that Hartley is waiting." "For what?" "For us to listen. Not just to his music, but to his method." Holmes abruptly crossed to the bureau and retrieved a small black notebook of his own. He began scribbling furiously across its pages. "The mistake we've made is assuming the recordings were the end of the performance. They were only the prelude." He looked up with sudden fire in his eyes. "We must return to Victoria Hall. Immediately." We arrived just past 11. The hall was closed to the public, its grand doors locked and its foyer shrouded in silence. Lestrade met us inside, his expression sceptical. "Hargreaves is in holding. We've gone through his papers. Nothing else incriminating beyond the forgeries." Holmes barely acknowledged him. "I require your cooperation, Inspector." He turned to a pair of constables standing nearby. "I want every light in the main, hall extinguished, every door locked but one, the Eastern performer's entrance. And I want a full rehearsal staged, precisely as if Hartley were to appear." Lestrade blinked. "Holmes, this man's not a ghost. You expect him to waltz back onto stage if we dim the lamps?" "I expect," Holmes said coolly, that he left a final act yet to play, and we are going to give him the cue. Lestrade hesitated, then gave the order. Soon the orchestra was gathered again, musicians murmuring in confusion as they took their places. Elena Vesalius stood with her violin at her side, eyes searching the darkened corners of the stage. Holmes approached her quietly. "You knew he had planned something," he said. She gave a slight nod, "Only that he asked me to perform the Echo Suite if ever he was declared missing." "And you agreed?" "Yes. I owe him that much." Holmes turned to the conductor's stand and took a folded sheet of music from his coat. "Play this. It's his final composition. Unfinished, perhaps, but not incomplete." The lights were lowered until the stage was lit only by the dull glow of a single chandelier. A hush fell over the hall. The musicians sat poised. Vesalius raised her bow. And then music, sparse, haunted. The notes rose in measured elegance, each rest thick with meaning. The melody was neither tragic nor triumphant. It was expectant, like the breath before a confession. Holmes stood in the shadows, eyes fixed on the east entrance. The door creaked open. A figure stepped into the light. The hoop orchestra faltered. Vesalius gasped. Henry Hartley stood before them, thinner, paler, but unmistakable. His eyes moved slowly across the stage, and when he spoke, his voice was soft and unwavering. "Play the rest," he said. Vesalius did, and Hartley walked slowly to the centre of the stage, each step deliberate, as though emerging from a long dream. When the music ended, silence returned, not the silence of uncertainty, but resolution. Lestrade approached, stunned. "Where have you been?" Hartley turned to Holmes. "Tell him." Holmes stepped forward. Hartley used the service tunnels to escape undetected. He hid beneath the hall, in the very heart of the building that betrayed him. A passage known only to a handful. He had food, water, shelter, and most importantly, time. Time to watch, time to listen. Hartley nodded. I had to know whether the truth would surface, or whether someone else would be buried for my absence. Lestrade shook his head. "You vanished, faked your own abduction, and let us chase ghosts." "I gave you the map," Hartley said, gesturing toward the phonograph's cylinders. "I left every note, but only Holmes read them." Holmes turned to the inspector. He didn't flee justice. He orchestrated it. Every message, every pause, every misdirection, it led us here, to the moment the culprit was unmasked. Lestrade exhaled. "And Hargreaves?" Hartley's expression hardened. "He betrayed my work. Tried to erase my name and replace it with his own. That's a crime graver than theft. It is artistic murder." Holmes nodded solemnly. He committed the perfect crime, except the victim refused to die. As the orchestra slowly rose from their seats, murmurs filled the air. Hartley's reappearance would be tomorrow's headline. But in that moment, it was not spectacle that mattered, but closure. Holmes turned to me. "The curtain has not yet fallen, Watson, but I dare say the audience has begun to applaud." Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The return of Henry Hartley sent tremors through every corner of the London arts community by the following morning. Though his reappearance had been witnessed by no more than 24 people, the orchestra, Inspector Lestrade, Holmes, and myself, rumours spread like fire across the city. The vanished virtuoso, the man who played silence, the composer's resurrection. The headlines wrote themselves, though Holmes remained thoroughly unimpressed by the press's tendency toward melodrama. Hartley, for his part, had chosen seclusion once more, though this time with Holmes's tacit approval. He had taken temporary refuge in the upper residence of Victoria Hall under police protection, speaking only to Holmes and Vesalius. Hargreaves remained in custody, his silence now less a position of strategy and more one of resignation. The final performance, Holmes assured me, was not in the music, but in the deduction. On that morning, Holmes called for a quiet breakfast in our sitting-room. The usual bustle of Baker Street felt far away, as though muffled by the weight of the case's closing revelations. "What remains," Holmes said, pouring tea with a steady hand, "is not proof, but understanding." I glanced up from the paper. "You're not satisfied?" "I am," he replied, "but satisfaction is a thing separate from comprehension. I know what happened, but only now do I understand how it came to be." He walked to the sideboard and withdrew a small folio of notes. Hartley's discarded sketches, retrieved from Hargreaves' trunk and returned by Lestrade. "These were the keys," he said, "not the wax cylinders, not the music performed, the fragments, the pages Hartley thought too flawed to keep." "Why?" I asked. "They were never published. They were rough drafts." "Exactly," Holmes said, "but they were his. Ideas he abandoned, yes, but ideas that still bore his unique mark. Phrases no other composer would have dared to construct. Hargreaves stole what Hartley had tossed aside, and in doing so believed he'd committed no crime. It was not the theft that drove Hartley to vanish. It was the insult." I nodded slowly. "So Hartley created a system, a kind of living will?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "A symphony in code. Each movement, the music, the phonograph, the missing bars, was designed not to reveal the culprit outright, but to exclude all others. Hartley knew that only someone capable of seeing music as language would follow the path correctly. That, in the end, is what he counted on." At that moment, a knock came at the door. It was Elena Vesalius. She entered with a calm poise that betrayed the tension in her voice. "He's asking for you," she said. "He says the last part is for Holmes alone." Holmes rose without a word. I followed him downstairs, and we took a carriage to Victoria Hall, where Hartley waited in a small dressing-room that overlooked the rear courtyard. He stood by the window, pale and thin, but with a fire in his eyes I had not seen since the day we opened the violin case. "You brought it?" he asked, his back still turned. Holmes stepped forward and placed the final folio of sketches on the table. "All recovered, untouched." Hartley turned slowly and regarded Holmes for a long moment. "You listened, more deeply than anyone else." "I merely heard what others dismissed." Hartley smiled faintly. "Then you are the only man who truly understood what I wrote." There was a silence, not a tense one, but a reflective, resonant hush that held more meaning than words could manage. Hartley spoke again. "Hargreaves believed music belonged to the hall, that without the institution I was nothing. But music belongs only to the silence that surrounds it. I had to make him hear that." Holmes gave a slight bow. And you did. Not through revenge, through reason. Hartley nodded. And what of Rainer? He feared you were dead, Holmes said, but his conscience has awakened. I suspect he'll devote the remainder of his years to ensuring your name is preserved. Hartley looked down at the sketches and touched one softly. These were imperfect, he said, and yet they were the most mine. Holmes inclined his head. That, perhaps, is the very point. We left him shortly after. As we stepped out into the corridor, I turned to Holmes. You told Lestrade the crime was not one of blood, but of erasure. Indeed. And now, Holmes said, pausing at the exit, the record has been restored. Then, back at Baker Street, Holmes returned to his chair, stretched out his long legs, and lit his pipe with a sigh of rare satisfaction. Would you say this case ranks among the strangest? I asked. Strange, yes, he said thoughtfully. But not because of the puzzle. No? It is not often, Holmes said, exhaling a long stream of smoke, that a man writes his own mystery and solves it before anyone else can. Then what was your role? He looked at me with the faintest of smiles, to ensure that the music reached the right ears, and with that he closed his eyes, not to rest, but to listen, as if in the quiet beyond the firelight. The final notes of the echo suite still lingered, unanswered and eternal. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. For a few days following Henry Hartley's reappearance, the storm of public fascination reached a fever pitch. Newspapers speculated endlessly. Rumours circulated of secret patrons, buried manuscripts, even conspiracies at the Royal Academy of Music. Through it all, Holmes remained disinterested in the noise. He preferred quiet truth over shouted speculation. But on the fourth morning after Hartley's return, Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, looking more harried than usual. His bowler hat sat crooked on his head, and his coat was still damp, with fog. He's gone, he said without preamble. Holmes looked up from his correspondence. Hartley. Lestrade shook his head. No, Hargreaves. I set down my teacup. Escaped? Vanished, Lestrade replied grimly. He was due for transfer to a secure holding facility. During the changeover, he claimed to feel faint. They took him into a side office to rest. 5 minutes later, gone. Holmes closed his letter with deliberate calm. You believe someone helped him? There's no sign of forced entry, no unlocked doors, but a service worker's uniform is missing, and the exit log was falsified. Holmes stood. Then Hargreaves is not finished. He's trying to rewrite the ending. We were in Lestrade's cab within minutes, speeding through a sluggish morning fog that clung to the city like gauze. Holmes sat still, his gloved hands resting lightly on his cane, eyes narrowed in contemplation. I never believed he would accept prison, he said quietly. A man like Hargreaves, obsessed with legacy, devoted to an institution he could no longer control, cannot abide the thought of fading into disgrace. You think he'll return to Victoria Hall? Holmes gave a slight nod. Where else would he go? It is not just the scene of his crime. It is the only place he ever believed himself seen. When we arrived, the hall was still shuttered to the public. A lone constable stood watch at the front, but Holmes bypassed him without explanation, striding through the side entrance and down the corridor toward the western stair. "I presume you've searched the tunnels," Holmes said over his shoulder. Lestrade, followed behind, winded. "Every inch, twice." "Then you searched for a man hiding," Holmes replied. "I'm searching for a man returning." We reached the sub-basement, the oldest section of Victoria Hall. The air was thick with dust and the faint metallic scent of damp stone. Holmes lit a lamp and turned sharply to the left, disappearing through a narrow arch I had never noticed before. "This way," he said. "I recall a forgotten stairwell near the original furnace chamber. Hartley mentioned it once, in one of his cylinders." We passed through a cracked brick arch, where the air grew colder, the light more reluctant. At the far end of the corridor, a wooden door stood ajar. Holmes slowed. Inside was a small chamber, no larger than a cupboard. A single stool stood in the centre. Upon it, laid with great care, was one of Hartley's missing manuscripts. A trap. Holmes's voice was low. "He's not running. He's trying to lure." Lestrade stepped forward. "What for?" Holmes bent and picked up the manuscript. It was blank. "He wants Hartley," Holmes said. "Not to kill him, to silence him, to stop the final humiliation. Hargreaves knows his theft is exposed, but if Hartley vanishes again, it becomes myth. The truth will dissolve. History will forget who truly wrote the music." At that moment, a faint sound echoed through the tunnel. Footsteps, careful and retreating. Holmes shot up. "Come, he's heading toward the West Performance Wing." We gave chase through the tunnels, our footsteps echoing in counterpoint to those ahead. We emerged near the performer's corridor, the hall still cloaked in pre-show dimness. Holmes froze, then pointed toward the empty orchestral stage. There, silhouetted behind the curtain, stood a figure. Tall, lean, his posture unmistakably rigid. Hargreaves. He had a pistol in one hand, though it trembled. Holmes stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "It ends here, Hargreaves. Put it down." Hargreaves didn't turn. Do you know what it feels like to be invisible? To work for years, building a sanctuary, for others? To watch them ascend while your name is forgotten? "I do not," Holmes said. "But I know that killing Hartley, or yourself, will not make the world remember you for the right reasons. He stole everything. He gave everything," Holmes corrected. "And what you took was not his genius, but his faith." Hargreaves's hands shook. The pistol lowered a fraction. "He doesn't deserve the applause. He doesn't need it," Holmes said gently. "But you do not mistake destruction for justice. If you silence him now, you prove his silence was wiser than his voice." Last, Hargreaves turned. His face was gaunt, eyes ringed with sleepless shadow. He dropped the gun. Lestrade stepped forward and cuffed him quietly. Saying nothing, Holmes watched as Hargreaves was led away, then turned to me with a sigh. "Even now," he said, "he wanted to conduct the ending, but Hartley's final note will not be his." I looked up at the curtain. "And what will be?" Holmes smiled faintly. "The truth, Watson, played in a key none of us expected." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in, the final clue revealed. It was nearly midnight when Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, after Hargreaves' final attempt to reclaim control of the narrative had been thwarted. The streets of London, slick with fog and rain, reflected the dim gaslights like a cracked mirror. The city seemed to hold its breath, as though the last notes of an unseen symphony were finally resolving into silence. Back in our familiar sitting room, Holmes moved with a mechanical precision. He shed his coat and gloves wordlessly, set his violin on the desk, then went straight to the phonograph. The 7 cylinders lay in their case nearby, already played, already known. And yet, something in Holmes's demeanour suggested that the performance, in his mind, was not quite complete. He selected the 4th cylinder, the one Hartley had recorded in his most cryptic tone, and replayed a brief section, then stopped it abruptly. "You see, Watson," he said, turning to me. "We heard what Hartley said, but we ignored the structure." "The structure?" Holmes walked to the mantelpiece and began to pace, eyes gleaming. "Each of the 7 cylinders follows a musical logic, not merely in content, but in arrangement. Hartley was composing a message in the form of a suite, not merely through language, but through form. There's a pattern to the emotional progression: doubt, fear, accusation, retreat. But it is the 5th and 6th cylinders that matter most." He turned sharply to the desk and unrolled the handwritten score Vesalius had performed, the Echo Suite. With a soft cloth, he rubbed the edge of the parchment under lamplight. Faint lines, measuring dots, emerged. Holmes smiled. "Coded tempo, markings," he said. "They correspond not to rhythm, but to order. The cylinders were misnumbered deliberately. Hartley wanted only the one who understood his method to reconstruct the truth." I stepped beside him. Then the message wasn't just hidden in the recordings, it was hidden in how they were arranged. Precisely. The 7th cylinder is not the end. It is the penultimate movement. The real finale comes earlier. He buried it in what we thought was an interlude, cylinder 2. Holmes placed it into the phonograph and wound the crank slowly. Hartley's voice returned, quieter than in the others. The tone was almost reflective, hesitant. "If I vanish, remember this. The greatest danger is not the man who lies, but the one who convinces others to lie for him." A pause. "Then there is a place where the sound fails, a chamber beneath the hall where even the tuning fork falters. That is where the theft began, and that is where it must end." Holmes leaned back. The vault beneath the west wing frowned. "But that was searched, wasn't it?" "Only superficially," Holmes said. "We looked for a hiding place. Hartley is pointing us not to a place where something is hidden, but to a place where something was taken." He rose with sudden urgency, gathering the lantern from the shelf. "Come, Watson. One more movement remains." Victoria Hall was empty when we arrived, its halls echoing only the occasional groan of timber and the faintest whisper of wind under the eaves. A single constable let us in without question. Lestrade had seen to that. Holmes led us through the main chamber and down into the western vaults, a section carved into the foundations beneath the hall in the days of Queen Victoria. These passages, now seldom used, had once housed instruments, props, and sensitive materials in colder months. We passed a rusted door and descended a narrow spiral stair. The walls were rough-hewn stone, damp to the touch. "Listen," Holmes said suddenly. I stopped. Nothing. Then faintly, a low, sustained hum, barely perceptible, like the vibration of a tuning fork left alone to fade. Holmes stepped forward and found a narrow crack in the wall, one that, upon closer inspection, was not a flaw in the stone, but a seam. "A false panel," he said, "cleverly constructed, sealed by compression. No one would think to look behind a wall that hums with its own frequency." He pressed a flat iron key against the seam, one of the tuning rods Hartley had once used in rehearsal. With a click, the panel gave way. Inside was a chamber no larger than a wardrobe, and there, stacked neatly in the shadows, were original Hartley manuscripts, dozens of them. Some I recognized from the cylinder's themes, others were entirely unknown. But that was not all. Holmes reached deeper and retrieved a small ledger bound in cracked leather. The name etched into the front Hargreaves inside were pages upon pages of detailed logs, dates, times, notations, and crude transcriptions of Hartley's work, copied by hand. Some were annotated, reconstructed from rehearsal, scored over Hartley's motif, draft ready for submission. Holmes flipped the final page. There, written in a hand both desperate and proud, "They will never know. Once performed, all sound belongs to the hall." Holmes closed the book. "This is it," he said. "Proof beyond question. Not merely theft, but chronic deception. Hartley was right. Hargreaves built his reputation from the dust of discarded genius." We carried the materials back to the surface in silence. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. Holmes turned to me as we stepped onto the empty street. "In the end," he said, "it wasn't the violin case, the scores, or the tunnels. It was the one thing every musician lives by, but every thief forgets to honour. And what is that?" He looked out over the rooftops of London. Structure. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. It was a grey Sunday afternoon when Holmes summoned everyone to Victoria Hall for what he referred to, with characteristically dry wit, as the final recital. The great auditorium had been closed to the public since Hartley's reappearance, but now it was quietly opened for a singular purpose, not for music, but for truth. By Holmes's design, the gathering was intimate. Present were Inspector Lestrade, Eleanor Vesalius, Paul Reiner, Alain Dupont, and at Holmes's insistence, Cyril Hargreaves, now under armed escort. The man sat rigidly in one of the front pews, his face drained of colour but composed in that peculiar way only the cornered manage. Holmes stood upon the low riser at the foot of the stage, not unlike a conductor preparing to begin a piece. But, instead of a baton, he held a thin folder of Hartley's original manuscripts in one hand and Hargreaves' stolen ledger in the other. "I thank you all for attending," he began, his voice cool and resonant in the vaulted chamber. "This is not a performance, though it may contain certain dramatic flourishes. This is the unveiling of what was stolen, and what has now, finally, been restored." A hush fell across the room. Even Lestrade, who had attended his fair share of Holmes's grand conclusions, seemed particularly alert. Holmes turned to Vesalius. "Miss Vesalius, when you played the Echo Suite, you followed a score left for you in fragments. Did it strike you as incomplete?" She nodded slowly. "It was beautiful but hollow, as though the soul of it had been excised. Because it had, Holmes replied. The soul resided not in the melody, but in the structure. Hartley's true message was hidden not in the notes played, but in the ones left out. The rests, the missing measures. They were not errors. They were encoded warnings. He stepped closer to the stage. Cyril Hargreaves understood this. For years he had access to Hartley's early drafts, pages discarded or left unfinished. He studied them, transcribed them, and slowly transformed himself from caretaker of Victoria Hall into a silent parasite. He convinced himself that by preserving what Hartley ignored, he was honouring the music. Hargreaves did not flinch, but his jaw tightened. Holmes opened the stolen ledger. What he did, however, was theft. Chronicled in his own hand, he lifted phrases, bars, even full passages from Hartley's works, and passed them to other composers, some complicit, others unwitting. In doing so, he corrupted the entire creative lineage of this institution. He held up one of the sheets. This motif, for instance, appears in Variations on a London Fog, attributed to Dupont. Holmes turned his gaze to the conductor. Would you care to explain that? Dupont paled. I was given the passage. I assumed it was an orphaned phrase from a workshop. It came to me through Mr. Hargreaves. I believe you, Holmes said without rancour. That is the genius of Hargreaves' plan. He operated beneath suspicion by targeting fragments, not completed works. No one suspected a man without a musical legacy of his own to be the origin of so many imitations. He turned next to Paul Reiner. You, Mr. Reiner, were not complicit, but you were cowardly. You suspected something was amiss. You saw Hartley's torment and chose to remain silent. Reiner looked down, his hands clenched. I didn't know what to believe, he murmured. Holmes softened just slightly. You were young, but remember, inaction, when faced with erosion of truth, is a kind of betrayal. Finally, Holmes turned to Hargreaves himself. You tried to erase Hartley not through violence, but by replacing his identity. You attempted a murder, not of the body, but of memory. A composer's voice, once distorted, is difficult to reclaim. Hargreaves said nothing, but his hands, once clasped tightly, had begun to tremble. You failed, Holmes said simply. He held up Hartley's restored manuscripts. These are the final chords, recovered from the chamber beneath the hall. You kept them as trophies, but they are proof of authorship, of intent, of theft. Lestrade stepped forward then. That's enough for a full conviction. Holmes nodded and stepped down from the platform. The tension in the room did not lift, but it shifted. Where once it had been suffocating, now it hung like a solemn resolution, the final reverberating note at the end of a long performance. Hartley entered quietly from the wings, all eyes turned to him. He looked not victorious, but vindicated, pale, solemn, and oddly peaceful. Holmes gestured for him to speak. I am not here to celebrate, Hartley said, his voice low but firm, nor to accuse. I am here to reclaim. He moved to the centre of the hall and opened a black leather folder. Inside were the 7 cylinders, now silent relics of his greatest composition. I wrote a symphony in silence, a fugue of absence, but no longer. It is time for the music to live again. He turned to Vesalius. Elena, would you honour me one last time? She stood without hesitation and took the stage. The musicians followed her instinctively. No orders were given, no rehearsal needed. They knew what to do. Holmes passed her a freshly copied score, one drawn from Hartley's restored manuscripts, the Echo Suite, complete. As she lifted her bow and the orchestra followed, the first true notes of Hartley's reclaimed legacy filled the hall. It was not triumphant nor bitter. It was whole, and that, perhaps, was the most powerful sound of all. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down. The crime later that evening, after the final movement of the Echo Suite had faded into the high rafters of Victoria Hall, the crowd dispersed with a quiet reverence. There had been no applause. None had been needed. The music itself had spoken, not just to the notes reclaimed, but to the ordeal behind them. The hall that had once threatened to erase a man's name now stood as witness to its preservation. Back at Baker Street, as lamplight flickered against the windows and the city outside settled into its nocturnal rhythm, Holmes finally relented to my persistent request. Holmes, I said, as he paced between his chair and the hearth. The story, if you please. I followed the threads as best I could, but I would like to hear it all, laid bare without riddles or metaphor. He smiled faintly, struck a match, and lit his pipe. Very well, Watson. Let us unwind it, one string at a time. I reached for my notebook. Holmes began. It started, of course, with ambition, Hargreaves. Not the ambition of a villain, in the classic sense, but the quieter, more insidious kind. The hunger for legacy, for recognition denied. A failed composer, a competent administrator, a man who gave his life to a building and received no ovation in return. He sat down, smoke curling upward. When Hartley rose to fame, Hargreaves saw in him both miracle and insult. Here was a man lauded as a genius, whose music redefined chamber technique, and yet who composed in solitude, discarded drafts, and jealously guarded his scores. To Hargreaves it was waste. Worse, it was hoarding. So he began to take, not overtly, not maliciously. At first, just copies of drafts Hartley had tossed aside. Fragments, sketches, which he then passed off, I asked. Indeed, Holmes said. Not under his own name, not at first, but to other composers. He whispered suggestions, presented motifs, convinced others to reimagine what he recovered. The theft was collaborative, distributed, and therefore invisible. I nodded. And Hartley eventually noticed, Holmes said. He suspected his phrases were echoing in unfamiliar mouths. He became paranoid, protective. He stopped sharing drafts, hid his work in unused vaults, started using Fielding as a courier. But that only confirmed Hargreaves' belief that Hartley viewed himself above the institution. Holmes tapped his pipe. Then came the rosin. The poison, I said. A subtle sabotage, Holmes confirmed. The resin was laced with a thickening agent that caused the bow hairs to seize during rehearsal. It didn't kill Hartley. It humiliated him, enough to scare him. And fear, Watson, is a great composer of contingency plans. He leaned forward. Hartley didn't vanish in fear. He vanished in preparation. He created the phonograph suite, coded his testimony across musical movements, planted the violin case as misdirection, hid his manuscripts in the vault behind the compression wall. Every step was calculated, not just to expose the thief, but to protect the music itself. "And the suspects?" I asked. Holmes recited them as if reading a score. Rainer, the apprentice, guilty of cowardice, not conspiracy. He knew something was wrong, but lacked the resolve to act. He tried to break in and listen to the cylinders before the full truth emerged. But he wasn't Hartley's enemy. Just a frightened young man on the verge of professional collapse. DuPont, innocent, but used. He accepted a theme from Hargreaves, believing it to be a reclaimed fragment. His mistake was ignorance, not deceit. Vesalius, trusted but uninformed. Hartley never revealed the full scope to her, only that she might one day be asked to perform the Echo Suite if he disappeared. She held the key to the performance, but not the crime. He paused, exhaling, and then there was the structure. I looked up. The hidden code. Yes, Holmes said. Hartley understood that language can be forged, but structure cannot. He rearranged the cylinders out of order, knowing that only someone who understood the form of a suite, its emotional arc, would realize the numbering was a lie, and once we played them in the true sequence, the buried message emerged. He stood and walked to the desk, retrieving the black leather ledger with Hargreaves's name. This was the final proof. Dates, annotations, forged attributions, all of it in Hargreaves' own hand. He wanted Hartley gone so he could continue the charade, or at least ensure the truth died with Hartley's obscurity. And when Hartley returned, I said. He panicked, Holmes replied, escaped custody, staged one last attempt, hoping to silence Hartley again or destroy the manuscripts. But it was too late. The truth had been played aloud. Before an audience, before witnesses. He sat again, looking tired now, as though the weight of so much silence had finally pressed down on him. "Sometimes, Watson," he said, "the most dangerous crime is not one of passion, but of patience. The quiet thief, the slow erasure. It does not scream, it whispers, it fades. And yet," I said gently, "Hartley did not fade, no." Holmes agreed, a rare glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Because we listened." A log cracked in the fire. Outside, a distant church bell marked the hour. I closed my notebook. "Thank you, Holmes," I said. "I shall title the chapter The Man Who Composed in Silence." Holmes smiled faintly, and for the first time in days leaned back into his chair, not as a detective, but as a man content. "An apt title," he murmured. "Now, let's have no more violins for a while." Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. In the weeks that followed the unravelling of the mystery at Victoria Hall, the ripples of revelation spread far beyond Baker Street and the closed circle of musicians and suspects. What had begun as a strange vanishing act evolved into something far more intricate. A public reckoning with stolen genius, institutional silence, and the resurrection of a composer nearly erased by envy. Cyril Hargreaves was tried, swiftly. The evidence Holmes unearthed, his personal ledger, the stolen manuscripts and the misattributed musical scores, was irrefutable. But it was the testimony of Henry Hartley himself delivered with quiet resolve in the courtroom, that left the most enduring impression. "I do not seek revenge," Hartley told the court, "only restoration. Let no artist, however forgotten or discarded, believe their work can be stolen without consequence. A melody born in silence is still a melody." The jury took less than 2 hours to convict Hargreaves of fraud, intellectual theft, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. But Holmes believed, as did I, that the real punishment for Hargreaves had already been delivered. His name, once buried behind the machinery of Victoria Hall, was now exposed for all to scrutinize, not as a forgotten steward, but as the saboteur of brilliance. Scotland Yard, for its part, claimed no small credit for the solution, and Lestrade never one to let pride stand in the way of public approval, happily offered a summary to the press. Holmes, predictably, declined all interviews, and declined even more firmly the suggestion of a formal commendation. "I merely listened," he said, when Lestrade attempted to toast him at the Diogenes Club. "The man composed his own solution. I simply transcribed it." For Hartley, the return to public life was cautious. He resumed composing, though less frequently, and often in private. He gave no public statements beyond a short letter published in the Times, thanking those who heard beyond the noise. He donated the original wax cylinders and his restored manuscripts to the British Museum's Music Archive, with the stipulation that the Echo Suite be performed once a year, an annual act of remembrance for the things nearly lost. Elena Vesalius resumed her performances, but now introduced herself not as the first violin of Victoria Hall, but as the interpreter of Hartley's final message. Her reputation soared in the months that followed, though she never accepted personal credit for the suite's reconstruction. Paul Reiner, shaken by the ordeal, left London temporarily. Word reached us through Vesalius that he had taken up a teaching position in Salzburg. In his farewell letter to Holmes, he wrote, "Thank you for showing me that silence, too, has a moral weight. I will try to be braver next time." As for Holmes, once the final newspaper folded and the last telegram of thanks was burned in the hearth, he returned to his violin, not to solve puzzles, but simply to play. I often found him at dusk, standing by the window, coaxing from the strings a tune that drifted upward and out into the London air, like a farewell without words. One afternoon, several weeks after the trial, I found Holmes examining the remnants of Hartley's original score. He traced the margins, still smudged with faint notations and performance markings, and tapped lightly on a passage near the end. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he asked. I listened. There was no sound. "Still silence," I said. "Exactly," he murmured. "But now it's no longer hiding something. It's holding something." "A difference? Entirely," Holmes said. "Before, the silence was an evasion, a mask, a barrier. But now it is what follows resolution, not absence, completion." I looked down at the faded score. "A coda," I said. Holmes smiled. "Yes, Watson, a coda." Outside, a carriage clattered past on Baker Street, and a street organ played some cheerful waltz in the distance, unaware of the symphony that had unfolded behind the city's stone facades. The case of Henry Hartley and the violin case was, on paper, concluded, the theft exposed, the culprit sentenced, the music reclaimed. And yet as I looked across the room at Holmes, his face half-shadowed in the evening light, eyes lost in thought, I understood what he had long known. Some mysteries end not with answers, but with a pause, a deliberate rest, one final breath before silence returns to its rightful place, not as erasure, but as grace. Chapter 18. Holmes's final reflection. Was a week after the trial that Holmes and I took our customary stroll through Hyde Park, an unspoken tradition following the closure of a particularly thorny case. The spring air was crisp but kind, the clouds moving lazily above the trees, like thoughts not yet fully formed. Holmes walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his long stride steady, his gaze lost somewhere in the space between clouds and memory. For some time we said nothing. At last I broke the silence. "You haven't taken another case?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "No, nor shall I for a while. That is, unlike you." He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Do you know, Watson, in all our years together, we have chased murderers, unmasked blackmailers, unravelled forgeries, even outwitted spies. But this case was different," I nodded, "because the crime was theft." "No," he said, "because the crime was almost successful." We came to rest at a bench overlooking the Serpentine. He sat, gazing at the slow-moving waters, and I followed. Cyril Hargreaves did not need a weapon, nor a motive drawn from hatred or profit. He needed only proximity, patience, and the assurance that no one would ever look closely. And had Hartley been a lesser man, less obsessive, less precise, less brave, it would have worked. His music would have disappeared into other hands, his name remembered only as a footnote. Holmes paused, drawing in a thoughtful breath. "Erasure is more terrifying than death, Watson, because it is quiet, because it does not shock, because it happens slowly while the world claps along." I said nothing for a while, and yet, I finally offered, "You saw through it." He allowed himself a small, almost reluctant smile. "Only because Hartley left a trail I was uniquely qualified to follow. The violin case, the missing measures, the silences. He constructed a puzzle that did not require my brilliance, only my willingness to listen." "That's still brilliance," I said. "Perhaps," he allowed. "But it was his brilliance, not mine." We watched a swan glide by, indifferent to our musings. After a long pause, Holmes rose and began to walk again. I followed, knowing the moment was not yet finished. "Will he compose again?" I asked. "He already has," Holmes replied, quietly. "Under another name, perhaps, or under none at all. But I suspect that's the only way he can bear it now. No fanfare, no claims, just music." "And you?" I asked. "What did you take from this?" He turned to me then, his grey eyes softened by the fading light. "That silence," he said, "is not always the absence of truth. Sometimes it is where the truth waits." We returned to Baker Street by nightfall. The lamplighters were already at work, illuminating the narrow roads of Marylebone one by one. Mrs. Hudson had laid out tea, but Holmes ignored it. Instead, he walked to the mantel, took down his violin, and tuned it slowly. Then, without a word, he began to play. The melody was unfamiliar, slow, deliberate, with pauses that held meaning only Holmes could articulate. It was not Hartley's, nor was it Bach, or Paganini, or any known composer. It was quiet, it was solitary, it was his. And as the final note lingered in the room, I realized what Holmes had known all along, that some puzzles do not end in revelation, they end in recognition.